In December 1944, the British Empire mourned a fallen hero. Conservative MP Jack Macnamara received a state funeral, honored for sacrificing his life in the mud of Italy to defeat fascism. Yet just years earlier, this same British MP was funneling money directly to the enemy, caught hunting for young boys in a gay Hitler youth brothel in Berlin. MI5 knew everything about his treasonous double life, and they actively buried it. But by refusing to arrest a compromised politician, they unwittingly handed the keys of the British government straight to a KGB spy. The year 1935 was a defining moment for the British Empire, a period characterized by a profound, almost paralyzing anxiety. The memory of the First World War was not a page in a history book. It was a living, breathing trauma. Nearly every family in Britain had a vacant chair at the dinner table, a father, brother, or son swallowed by the mud of the Somme or Passchendaele. The British public and the political class shared a single desperate consensus. There could not be another European war. This collective trauma shaped the policy of appeasement, creating a political environment where avoiding conflict with Germany was prioritized above almost all else. Into this fragile and highly reactive political climate stepped John Robert Macnamara. When he won the parliamentary seat for Chelmsford in the 1935 general election, he was exactly what the Conservative Party machinery needed. He possessed the impeccable credentials required to reassure a nervous public. He was an officer, he was articulate, and he projected the rugged, dependable image of a man who could defend the empire's traditional values. For the Conservative government under the leadership of Stanley Baldwin and later Neville Chamberlain, maintaining a unified, morally unassailable front was crucial. They were navigating a deeply unpopular domestic landscape of economic recovery and industrial strikes, while casting nervous glances across the English Channel at the militarization of the Third Reich. Macnamara's position as a member of Parliament provided him with an extraordinary level of privilege and protection. In the 1930s, the British class system was an iron fortress. A Conservative MP was not merely a public servant, he was considered the moral arbiter of society. The police, the press, and the intelligence services operated under a tacit understanding that the ruling elite were to be protected from public scandal whenever possible. This deference to authority was Macnamara's greatest asset. It formed an invisible shield around him, a presumption of innocence and virtue based entirely on his social standing and his political affiliation. However, the political landscape of the 1930s was not only defined by the fear of war, but also by a deep existential dread of communism. The Russian Revolution had sent shockwaves through the British upper classes. For many aristocrats, industrialists, and conservative politicians, the spread of Bolshevism was a far more immediate and terrifying threat than the rise of fascism in Germany. Adolf Hitler, with his fierce anti-communist rhetoric and brutal suppression of the German left wing, was quietly viewed by a significant faction of the British elite as a necessary bulwark. They saw Nazi Germany as a chaotic but useful buffer state that could absorb and destroy the Soviet threat before it reached Western Europe. This intersection of fear and strategic calculation gave birth to organizations like the Anglo-German Fellowship. Founded in 1935, the Fellowship was ostensibly a society dedicated to fostering mutual understanding, trade, and cultural exchange between Britain and Germany. In reality, it was a high society political front. Its membership list, read like a registry of the British establishment, including prominent dukes, members of parliament, directors of the Bank of England, and the CEOs of major corporations. They held lavish dinners at the Savoy Hotel in London, frequently hosting high-ranking Nazi officials like Joachim von Ribbentrop. The fellowship normalized the Nazi regime within British high society, wrapping the brutal realities of the Third Reich in the respectable cloak of diplomacy and commerce. Macnamara recognized the Anglo-German fellowship as the perfect vehicle for his own hidden agendas. By becoming an active and visible member, he could justify frequent, entirely sanctioned trips to Germany under the guise of parliamentary fact-finding and diplomatic networking. His travel was funded, his access was guaranteed, and his motives were completely unquestioned by his colleagues in Westminster. He was on paper doing the necessary work of the government, building bridges with a difficult European neighbor. But managing the logistics of international travel, political correspondence, and the rigorous social schedule of the fellowship required assistance. Macnamara needed a secretary. He needed someone sharp, organized, and socially adept enough to navigate both the corridors of Westminster and the complex diplomatic landscape of Berlin. Through the tightly knit networks of the British upper class, Macnamara was introduced to Guy Burgess. On the surface, Burgess seemed like an eccentric but brilliant choice. Educated at Eton and Cambridge, Burgess possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of history and politics, a devastatingly sharp wit, and a magnetic, albeit chaotic, charm. He knew everyone who mattered, and he understood how power operated in London. For an ambitious MP like Macnamara, having a secretary with Burgess's social connections and intellectual pedigree was a significant asset. What Macnamara did not know was that Guy Burgess was living a double life far more dangerous than his own. During his time at Cambridge, Burgess had been recruited by Arnold Deutsch, an operative for the Soviet NKVD, the precursor to the KGB. Burgess was an ideological fanatic, deeply committed to the communist cause, and he had been instructed by his Soviet handlers to abandon his public left-wing associations. His mission was to penetrate the British establishment, to adopt the persona of a right-wing reactionary, and to gather intelligence on British foreign policy, particularly regarding Germany. When Burgess secured the position as Macnamara's secretary, the Soviet intelligence apparatus scored a monumental victory. Burgess now had direct, unfettered access to a Conservative member of Parliament who was actively involved in shaping Anglo-German relations. He had keys to filing cabinets, access to private political correspondence, and a front-row seat to the internal debates of the ruling party. The dynamic between Macnamara and Burgess was a masterclass in mutual exploitation. Macnamara used Burgess to manage his political life and, more importantly, to facilitate his illicit activities. Burgess was highly efficient at arranging the discreet logistics of their travel, ensuring that diplomatic bags were utilized and that their itineraries provided ample time away from official prying eyes. Burgess, who was also homosexual and notoriously reckless in his private life, provided Macnamara with a companion who would not judge, report, or question the MP's darkest impulses. In return, Burgess used Macnamara as the ultimate camouflage. No one in British intelligence was looking for a Soviet spy inside the office of a patriotic, pro-military conservative. MP Macnamara's unassailable status provided Burgess with an ironclad alibi. When Burgess traveled to Germany with Macnamara, he wasn't just managing the MP's schedule, he was conducting espionage for Moscow. The Soviet Union was desperate for on-the-ground intelligence regarding the militarization of Germany, the stability of the Nazi regime, and the true intentions of the British government regarding appeasement. Burgess was gathering this intelligence, paid for by the British taxpayer and shielded by parliamentary privilege. As the year 1936 approached, the geopolitical temperature in Europe continued to rise. Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland, directly violating the Treaty of Versailles. And the British government had done nothing but issue mild diplomatic protests. Emboldened by this lack of resistance, the Nazi regime began to accelerate its domestic and foreign agendas. It was against this backdrop of escalating tension that Macnamara and Burgess prepared for their most extensive series of trips to Berlin. They packed their bags and boarded the trains. To the colleagues at Victoria Station, they were two dedicated public servants on a diplomatic mission. But crossing the border into the Third Reich, the political masks slipped. London's polite society vanished. Berlin was vibrating with violence and hidden vices. Macnamara wasn't traveling to prevent a war. He was traveling to lose himself in the darkest corners of the enemy's capital. And he was completely unaware that the man sitting across from him was meticulously recording every compromised step. The train pulling into Berlin's Anhalter Bahnhof in 1936 delivered Jack Macnamara and Guy Burgess into a city of terrifying contradictions. On the surface, the German capital was a monument to order, discipline, and the absolute power of the Nazi state. The streets were immaculately clean, draped in massive swastika banners in preparation for the upcoming Olympic Games. The regime was desperate to project an image of a unified, healthy, and morally pure society to the rest of the world. Uniforms were everywhere. The black of the SS, the brown of the SA, and the crisp insignia of the Hitler Youth. It was a society that demanded total conformity and punished deviation with brutal efficiency. But when the sun set and the official diplomatic functions concluded, the pristine facade of the Third Reich fractured. Beneath the mandated order lay a desperate, fractured underworld, a remnant of the permissive Weimar Republic that the Nazis had officially crushed but practically merely driven into the shadows. This was the Berlin that Macnamara had come to find. Leaving behind the safety of high-end hotels and the polite company of the Anglo-German Fellowship, the British Member of Parliament shed his public persona. He was no longer the respectable conservative lawmaker. He was a man hunting for a very specific, highly dangerous release. Macnamara's appetite was exclusively for what was known as rough trade. He had no interest in the intellectual or aristocratic gay circles of Berlin. Instead, he sought out the grittiest, most perilous elements of the city's working class. He wanted soldiers, laborers, and the destitute young men who had been swallowed by the Nazi machine. This staggering audacity unfolded against a terrifying legal reality in Nazi Germany during the mid-1930s. The regime had weaponized a piece of legislation known as Paragraph 175, expanding it to criminalize almost any form of intimacy between men. A mere look, a touch, or an insinuation could result in arrest, brutal interrogation, and imprisonment in a concentration camp. The Gestapo actively hunted homosexuals, relying on a vast network of civilian informants to root them out. It was an environment of absolute terror. Yet into this deadly environment walked a sitting British politician, armed with a diplomatic passport and a wallet full of hard currency. Macnamara bypassed the heavily monitored civilian bars and headed toward places like the vast shadowed expanses of the Tiergarten, Berlin's Central Park, which had long served as a clandestine meeting ground. Here, the economic realities of the Third Reich clashed with its moral posturing. Many of the young men in the paramilitary organizations, the Sturmabteilung SA, and the Hitler Youth, came from impoverished backgrounds. Despite the Nazi propaganda boasting of economic miracles, daily life for the rank and file was often a struggle for basic necessities. Foreign currency, particularly the British pound, held immense power. Macnamara leveraged this economic desperation to buy the physical affection of the very troops sworn to destroy everything his own nation stood for. The hypocrisy of the situation was staggering on both sides. The Nazi regime publicly executed and imprisoned men for homosexuality, yet its own youth organizations and paramilitary wings harbored an open secret. In the SA, despite the bloody purge of its homosexual leader Ernst Röhm 2 years prior, during the Night of the Long Knives, a hyper-masculine, deeply entrenched culture of male intimacy survived among the lower ranks. These young men, heavily indoctrinated in fascist ideology during the day, were willing to sell their bodies at night to a wealthy foreign official. For Macnamara, the appeal was inextricably linked to this danger. There was a potent, undeniable psychological dynamic at play. He was a member of the British elite, a man of profound privilege, exerting complete financial and physical dominance over the foot soldiers of a hostile, terrifying regime. Every transaction was a profound risk. He was taking the young men who were being trained to march on Europe, stripping them of their formidable uniforms, and reducing them to compliant partners for a few hours in a cheap rented room. It was an act of profound recklessness, a game of Russian roulette played with his life, his career, and the security of the British Empire. Beside him, through all of this, was Guy Burgess. The dynamic between the two men during these nocturnal excursions was deeply complex. Burgess, unapologetically gay and notoriously promiscuous himself, participated in the Berlin underground alongside his employer. But while Macnamara was consumed by his physical desires, Burgess was operating on a completely different level. Burgess was an apex predator of intelligence. While Macnamara saw a young SA stormtrooper as a conquest, Burgess saw an intelligence asset. Through these intimate, illicit encounters, Burgess was able to take the temperature of the Nazi regime from the bottom up. He listened to the pillow talk of the Hitler Youth and the complaints of the foot soldiers. He noted the low morale, the economic grumbling, the internal corruption, and the vast gap between the regime's propaganda and the reality on the ground. While the British MP was compromising himself beyond repair, his secretary was meticulously compiling mental dossiers. Burgess realized that the strict puritanical facade of the Nazi state was a lie, highly vulnerable to financial leverage and human weakness. This was exactly the kind of granular, on-the-ground intelligence that his handlers in Moscow were desperate to acquire. The Soviet Union needed to know if the German military machine was as unified and invincible as Hitler claimed. Burgess, utilizing the perfect cover of Macnamara's sexual tourism, was finding out that it was not. However, neither man fully grasped the efficiency of the surveillance net they were swimming in. The Gestapo was not the bumbling local police force of London. It was a highly sophisticated, ruthlessly organized intelligence apparatus. Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the Gestapo, had built a sprawling empire of information. He understood that foreign diplomats and politicians were often shielded from direct physical harm, but they were highly vulnerable to blackmail. Heydrich established specific protocols for monitoring the known homosexual meeting places in Berlin. The Gestapo planted informants in bars, bribed hotel clerks, and ran extensive surveillance operations in the Tiergarten. They actively gathered leverage on foreign officials, knowing that a scandal could be weaponized to manipulate foreign policy, force resignations, or recruit involuntary spies for the Reich. Macnamara's behavior was so blatant and his targets so explicitly tied to the Nazi state that historical accounts suggest his reckless behavior likely drew the attention of the Gestapo's monitoring system. He was a foreign official repeatedly making contact with military personnel in an illegal, highly compromising context. He was leaving a trail of foreign currency and recognizable faces in his wake. The trap was setting. The German secret police were quietly compiling a dossier on the Conservative member of Parliament for Chelmsford. They were documenting his preferences, his roots, and the identities of the German youths he was paying. Macnamara was no longer just an observer in a foreign land. He was a vital, volatile asset, sitting in the files of the enemy, completely oblivious to the fact that the tightening noose around his neck could easily take the entire British government down with him. The filing cabinets inside the Gestapo headquarters at Prince Albrechtstrasse did not operate on morality. They operated on leverage. Reinhard Heydrich, the cold, calculating architect of the Nazi intelligence apparatus, understood a fundamental truth about human nature. Men in power are rarely undone by their political ideologies, but they are consistently destroyed by their private vices. The Gestapo did not need to assassinate foreign diplomats or stage elaborate kidnappings to influence international affairs. They simply needed to watch, wait, and document. Jack Macnamara's file was growing thick. The German secret police were meticulous bookkeepers of human frailty. They had a dedicated department specifically tasked with monitoring homosexuality, both domestic and foreign. They knew the routes Macnamara took when he left his respectable diplomatic hotels. They knew the specific bars he frequented in the Schöneberg district. Most devastatingly, they knew the identities of the young men he paid. The Gestapo recognized exactly what they had in their grasp. This was not a low-level clerk or a naive tourist. This was a sitting Conservative member of the British Parliament, a military officer and a vocal member of the Anglo-German Fellowship. The intelligence value of this blackmail material was astronomical. The Nazi regime now held a loaded gun to the head of the British political establishment. If Berlin chose to leak the information to the international press, providing dates, locations, and testimonies of a British lawmaker buying the sexual services of Hitler Youth and SA stormtroopers, the resulting explosion would shatter the British government. It would humiliate the Conservative Party, severely damage the credibility of the British military, and provide the Nazi propaganda machine with undeniable proof of the degenerate nature of Western democracy. Macnamara was oblivious to the blade resting against his throat. His behavior was driven by the supreme intoxicating arrogance of the British class system. He had spent his entire life in institutions, public schools, the military, Parliament, that taught him he was untouchable. He believed that the rules governing ordinary men simply did not apply to him. The danger of Berlin did not deter him, it fueled him. The adrenaline of slipping past the heavily armed guards of a fascist state to bed its foot soldiers was an addiction. He failed to realize that his aristocratic immunity did not extend across the English Channel. To the Gestapo, his parliamentary title was not a shield. It was a price tag. But the most damning aspect of this scandal was not taking place in Berlin. It was happening in London. The British intelligence service, MI5, was fully aware of the crisis. British intelligence in the 1930s operated an extensive network of informants across Europe. Agents operating out of the British embassy in Berlin, maintaining their own surveillance on high-profile British visitors and monitoring German counterintelligence, picked up the trail of Macnamara's nocturnal activities. Reports were drafted, coded, and sent back to London, landing on the desks of senior intelligence officers. The men running MI5, under the directorship of Sir Vernon Kell, were faced with a profound dilemma. Under the strict parameters of British law, particularly the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, Macnamara's actions constituted gross indecency. His behavior was a severe criminal offense that carried a mandatory prison sentence. Furthermore, from a counter-espionage perspective, Macnamara was a walking catastrophe. He was a primary target for hostile blackmail, actively compromising state secrets and national security with every illicit transaction. By any standard legal or military metric, MI5 should have detained Macnamara the moment he disembarked at Victoria Station. They should have interrogated him, stripped him of his security clearances, and handed him over to the Metropolitan Police for prosecution. They did absolutely nothing. The inaction of MI5 was not born of incompetence. It was a deliberate, calculated, and entirely cynical strategy of institutional self-preservation. The British intelligence apparatus did not exist solely to uphold the law. Its primary unspoken mandate was to protect the state and the ruling establishment. In 1936, the British state was highly vulnerable. The Conservative government was navigating the deeply divisive policy of appeasement, trying to hold a fractured nation together while the threat of war loomed. They were also dealing with internal crises, including the brewing scandal of King Edward VIII's relationship with Wallis Simpson, which would culminate in the abdication crisis later that year. The establishment could not survive another catastrophic moral failure. If MI5 arrested Macnamara, there would be a public trial. The press would descend. The horrifying details of an active MP trafficking young men from the ranks of the Nazi military would be broadcast across the world. The intelligence chiefs calculated that the political fallout of exposing the truth was far more dangerous to the stability of the British Empire than the crime itself. Therefore, a silent consensus was reached in the smoke-filled gentlemen's clubs of St. James's and the secure offices of Whitehall. MI5 decided to contain the threat by burying it. They placed Macnamara under observation, but explicitly blocked any law enforcement action against him. They intercepted the reports, classified them at the highest level of secrecy, and locked them away in steel vaults. They chose to let a compromised, treasonous lawmaker continue to sit in the House of Commons, voting on legislation and handling military secrets, rather than risk a scandal that might topple the government. The tragedy of the situation deepened with every trip they took. Back in London, Macnamara would stand up in the House of Commons, dressed in immaculate tailoring, speaking passionately about the need for British rearmament and national unity. He would attend high society dinners with the Anglo-German Fellowship, shaking hands with the very men whose intelligence officers held the power to destroy him. He lived a life of terrifying duality, a man entirely hollowed out by his own contradictions. He was a patriot who funded the enemy. He was a lawmaker who repeatedly broke the most severe laws of his land. He was a man of immense privilege who exploited the extreme poverty of a shattered nation for his own brief gratification. And the institutions that were designed to stop him, the police, the intelligence services, his political party, became his silent accomplices. They sacrificed justice, morality, and operational security on the altar of public relations. As the calendar turned from 1936 to 1937, the window for diplomatic resolution in Europe began to rapidly close. The trips to Berlin became increasingly dangerous. The atmosphere in the German capital grew heavier, more paranoid, and explicitly violent. The Gestapo tightened its grip, rounding up thousands of individuals deemed undesirable by the state, including homosexuals, and sending them to newly constructed camps. The men Macnamara had bought and used were now facing execution or brutal imprisonment by their own commanders. Yet the British MP continued to play his lethal game, shielded by a government that was terrified of the truth and accompanied by a spy who was methodically selling out the empire from within. The transition from 1937 into 1938 marked a terrifying acceleration in the brutality of the Third Reich, transforming the streets of Berlin from a landscape of hidden vice into a theater of open persecution. For Jack Macnamara, the playground was rapidly becoming a graveyard. Heinrich Himmler and the SS had fully consolidated their power, marginalizing the remnants of the SA and imposing a puritanical, lethal order across the nation. The Gestapo, under the specific directives of the newly formed Reich Central Office for the combating of homosexuality and abortion, began to execute sweeping, systematic raids. The shadowed groves of the Tiergarten and the illicit, smoke-filled basement bars of the Schöneberg district were no longer merely monitored. They were violently purged. Thousands of men were dragged from their homes, their barracks, and the streets, subjected to horrific interrogations, and shipped in cattle cars to the early concentration camps like Dachau and Sachsenhausen. The young, desperate, and compromised soldiers who had once traded their uniforms for British pounds in cheap hotel rooms were now being marked with the pink triangle, condemned to labor, starvation, and execution. The ecosystem of rough trade that Macnamara had so recklessly exploited was systematically dismantled by the very regime he was attempting to appease. This drastic shift fundamentally altered the dynamic of Macnamara's cross-channel excursions. He was no longer just a wealthy foreign dignitary indulging in illicit tourism. He was actively stepping into a highly orchestrated kill zone. The psychological toll of this realization must have been suffocating. Back in London, he walked the hallowed oak-paneled halls of Westminster, saluted by policemen and respected by his peers. He was a man of the law. But the moment his train crossed into Germany, a cold, undeniable terror had to have gripped him. He knew with absolute certainty that he was entirely at the mercy of the Gestapo. Every glance from a border guard, every unexpected knock on a hotel room door carried the very real threat of exposure, arrest, and the utter annihilation of his life. Yet the addiction to the danger, or perhaps the sheer momentum of his double life, propelled him forward. The most striking contradiction of Jack Macnamara's life emerged during these final agonizing years of peace. Even as he continued to compromise himself physically and morally within the borders of the Third Reich, his political perspective was undergoing a radical, almost schizophrenic awakening. As a military officer who had served in the territorials and understood the logistics of warfare, Macnamara could not ignore what he was witnessing in Germany. While his fellow politicians in the Anglo-German Fellowship were busy clinking champagne glasses with Joachim von Ribbentrop and praising the efficiency of the Autobahn, Macnamara was looking at the factories. He was observing the sheer terrifying scale of German rearmament. He saw the Luftwaffe darkening the skies and the mechanized panzer divisions conducting massive exercises. He realized that the Nazi war machine was not being built for defense. It was being built for continental domination. This realization birthed an extraordinary historical irony. The very man who had funded the Hitler Youth in secret, the man whose treasonous sexual exploits sat neatly filed in the blackmail dossiers of the Gestapo, returned to the House of Commons and began to sound the alarm. Macnamara started to actively push back against the strict appeasement policies of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He stood in Parliament, his voice echoing with the authority of a military man, and demanded that Britain wake up. He warned of the imminent threat, advocated for immediate massive British rearmament, and even defied the Conservative Party whip to vote in favor of establishing a Ministry of Supply to prepare the nation for a war he now knew was inevitable. It is a staggering psychological portrait. Macnamara was desperately trying to fortify the very nation he was simultaneously betraying. He was building the walls of the fortress while actively handing the enemy the keys to the back door. He lived in a state of constant, agonizing cognitive dissonance, driven by a genuine patriotism that was violently at odds with his uncontrollable, destructive, private desires. Guy Burgess watched this internal fracturing with the cold, detached amusement of a predator observing a wounded animal. For Burgess, Macnamara's shifting political stance was an intelligence goldmine. As Macnamara became more involved in the push for British rearmament, he gained access to highly sensitive military assessments, production schedules, and strategic debates within the War Office and the Cabinet. Burgess, maintaining his flawless facade as the loyal, indispensable secretary, simply absorbed this information. He was the perfect parasite, thriving on his host's access. When Macnamara drafted confidential memos regarding the desperately low stock of anti-aircraft ammunition or the vulnerabilities of the Royal Air Force, Burgess ensured that a carbon copy made its way out of the office. He utilized the cover of the busy parliamentary schedule to slip away to clandestine meetings with his Soviet handler, Arnold Deutsch, in the quiet parks and obscure cafes of London. The scale of the betrayal orchestrated from Macnamara's office is difficult to overstate. Burgess was transmitting the most intimate anxieties and strategic weaknesses of the British Empire directly to Moscow. The Soviet leadership, deeply paranoid about whether Britain would ally with Germany against the USSR, relied heavily on this intelligence to shape their own catastrophic diplomatic maneuvers, culminating eventually in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Burgess was altering the geopolitical map of the world, entirely shielded by a government that was too terrified of a sexual scandal to investigate his employer. The charade finally crashed into reality in the autumn of 1938. The Munich crisis brought Europe to the absolute brink of annihilation. Chamberlain flew to Germany and essentially handed the Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for a meaningless piece of paper promising peace for our time. The relief in London was palpable, but it was the hollow relief of a condemned man granted a temporary stay of execution. For Macnamara, Munich marked the definitive end of the illusion. The Anglo-German fellowship fractured, its purpose rendered obsolete by the sheer, naked aggression of the Nazi state. The diplomatic borders began to freeze. The frequent, unscrutinized trains to Berlin were halted. The curtain fell on the permissive, dangerous playground that had defined his secret life. The abrupt cessation of his travels left Macnamara stranded in London, forced to confront the wreckage he had created. He was safe, geographically, from the physical grip of the Gestapo, but the psychological trap remained fully armed. The files sitting in Berlin had not been destroyed. The photographs, the testimonies, the transaction records, they were all still there, waiting. If war broke out, the Nazi propaganda ministry could release the material at any moment, weaponizing his past to shatter the morale of the British public. He was a walking time bomb, completely dependent on the silence of an enemy he was now preparing to fight. On September 3rd, 1939, the agonizing tension finally snapped. Britain declared war on Germany. The sirens wailed across London, signaling the end of an era defined by political cowardice and aristocratic indulgence. Jack Macnamara did what was expected of a man of his station. He packed away his tailored parliamentary suits, left the echoing halls of Westminster, and put his military uniform back on. The transition was abrupt and total. The Conservative member of Parliament, who had spent the last 4 years dancing on the edge of treason, was suddenly transformed into a frontline commander. He was tasked with leading young British men into the meat grinder of a global conflict, ordering them to lay down their lives to destroy the very regime he had once so recklessly compromised himself with. The past was buried under the immediate, overwhelming demands of survival, but the past is rarely content to stay buried, and the reckoning for Jack Macnamara was only deferred, waiting for him on the battlefields of a shattered Europe. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 forced a sudden and absolute transformation upon Jack Macnamara. The complex, highly compromised political maneuvering of the past 4 years vanished overnight. The frequent trips to the continent, the clandestine meetings, and the elaborate diplomatic excuses were instantly replaced by the rigid, unyielding structure of military command. Macnamara was no longer a politician dabbling in foreign affairs. He was now a senior officer responsible for the lives of hundreds of young men. He was appointed as the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion of the London Irish Rifles. This was a territorial army unit, made up largely of working-class volunteers from across the capital. For Macnamara, the assignment presented a profound psychological collision. He was a man of immense wealth and privilege, educated at the finest institutions, now tasked with leading men who came from the very same socio-economic background as the young Germans he had systematically exploited in Berlin. Every day he stood in front of his battalion, inspecting their uniforms, assessing their readiness, and preparing them for the brutal reality of combat. He had to look into the faces of these young recruits, knowing the dark, unutterable secret he carried. He was ordering them to sacrifice their lives to destroy a regime whose paramilitary forces he had personally funded for his own sexual gratification. The contradiction was absolute. Yet, by all historical accounts, Macnamara was an exceptionally capable and dedicated commander. He cared for his men, ensured their training was rigorous, and earned their genuine respect. He compartmentalized his existence with a terrifying efficiency, locking the compromised politician in a mental vault and presenting only the resolute soldier to the world. However, the threat from his past did not disappear simply because he put on a uniform. If anything, the state of war amplified the danger. The Gestapo still held his file. The names, the transaction records, and the testimonies regarding his activities with the Hitler Youth and the SA were sitting in the archives of Prince Albrechtstrasse. For the first few years of the war, As Britain faced the Blitz and the constant threat of invasion, Macnamara lived under a unique invisible terror. Every time the German propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, took to the airwaves to broadcast demoralizing messages to the British public, Macnamara must have waited for his own name to be spoken. The Nazis frequently utilized blackmail and scandal to undermine the morale of the Allied forces. Exposing a sitting Conservative MP and active frontline commander as a sexual predator who preyed on German youths would have been a devastating psychological blow to the British establishment. Macnamara was forced to lead his men through the darkest days of the war, never knowing if today was the day his own past would be weaponized to destroy the very country he was trying to defend. The silence from Berlin, in retrospect, was likely a matter of bureaucratic priorities. The Nazi war machine was focused on the immediate physical conquest of Europe, utilizing a localized blackmail file against a single British MP may have simply slipped down the Gestapo's list of operational objectives. But Macnamara could not have known that. He lived every day with a loaded gun pointed at his reputation, held by an enemy he could not see. While Macnamara was consumed by the heavy responsibilities of command and the silent dread of exposure, his former secretary was experiencing a rapid and dangerous ascent. Guy Burgess did not put on a uniform and head to the front lines. Instead, he leveraged the impeccable connections he had cultivated while working for Macnamara to embed himself even deeper into the British establishment. Exploiting the exact institutional blind spot created for Macnamara years earlier, Burgess easily bypassed standard vetting and systematically infiltrated British intelligence. Burgess easily transitioned into a role at the BBC, where he produced propaganda broadcasts, a position that gave him wide access to political figures and confidential government directives. More alarmingly, he was soon recruited into Section D of MI6, the division responsible for covert sabotage and subversion across Europe. The irony was staggering. The man who had spent the late 1930s arranging illicit trips to Germany so an MP could sleep with the enemy, while simultaneously handing British state secrets to the Soviet Union, was now officially on the payroll of British intelligence. Burgess was given access to highly classified sabotage plans, training manuals for underground resistance movements, and the identities of British operatives working behind enemy lines. He meticulously copied these documents and handed them directly to his Soviet handlers. Moscow was receiving a comprehensive blueprint of British covert operations, provided by a spy whom the British government refused to investigate in order to protect the Conservative Party. The failure of MI5 to act against Macnamara in 1936 had metastasized into a catastrophic intelligence hemorrhage by 1941. Burgess was completely untouchable, operating with the arrogant confidence of a man who knew the institutions supposed to catch him were too terrified of their own secrets to look closely. As the war ground on, the focus of the British military shifted from homeland defense to taking the fight back to the Axis powers. For Macnamara and the London Irish Rifles, the long period of waiting in the UK finally came to an end. The battalion was mobilized for overseas deployment, leaving the relative safety of the British Isles for the brutal realities of the front line. They were sent into the Mediterranean theater, a campaign characterized by rugged terrain, extreme weather, and fierce entrenched German resistance. The transition from training camps in England to the reality of the battlefield was a harsh awakening. Macnamara, the former politician who had navigated the velvet-lined corridors of power in London, now found himself navigating minefields, artillery barrages, and the daily grinding attrition of infantry warfare. He proved to be a stoic and steady presence. The men he commanded did not see a compromised diplomat or a national security risk. They saw a commanding officer who ate the same rations, slept in the same mud, and faced the same incoming fire as they did. The duality of Jack Macnamara reached its absolute peak in these conditions. The man who had severely betrayed the moral and legal codes of his nation was now risking his physical life for it every single day. He was trying to balance the ledger, fighting a desperate private war for redemption alongside the global war against fascism. By late 1943, the Allied forces initiated the invasion of mainland Italy. Winston Churchill had famously described Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe, but the reality on the ground was a nightmare of blood and stone. The Italian peninsula is dominated by the Apennine Mountains, a spine of jagged peaks and deep valleys that provided the German army with perfect, natural defensive lines. The London Irish Rifles were thrust into this meat grinder. The campaign was not characterized by sweeping tank battles or rapid advances. It was a slow, agonizing crawl north, fighting village by village, ridge by ridge, through freezing rain and bottomless mud. The German forces, commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, executed a masterclass in defensive warfare, making the Allies pay a devastating price in blood for every mile of Italian soil. Macnamara led his battalion through some of the most grueling engagements of the campaign. He witnessed the horrific cost of the conflict firsthand. The young working-class men from London, the men he had trained and commanded for years, were being cut down in the mountains of a foreign country. The sheer scale of the suffering and the constant proximity to death stripped away all the political abstractions and societal privileges of his former life. There was no diplomatic immunity on the Gothic line. There was no Conservative Party shield to deflect a mortar shell. The man who had once treated the foot soldiers of the enemy as commodities to be purchased was now locked in a desperate, lethal struggle against them. The German troops holding the high ground above him were the same demographic, perhaps even the exact same generation, as the youths he had pursued in the Tiergarten just a few years earlier. The past and the present collided in the freezing mud of Italy, setting the stage for a final violent resolution that would allow the British Empire to rewrite history entirely. The winter of 1944 in Italy was a theater of absolute misery. The Allied advance had ground to a halt against the Gothic line, a massive, heavily fortified defensive perimeter constructed by the German army across the jagged peaks of the Apennine Mountains. The campaign had devolved into a brutal, static war of attrition. The rain was relentless, turning the valleys into bottomless swamps and the mountain passes into slick, freezing death traps. For the men of the 1st Battalion of the London Irish Rifles, the romanticized notions of liberating Europe had been entirely washed away, replaced by the daily, agonizing struggle to survive artillery barrages, trench foot, and the terrifying efficiency of the German machine gunners holding the high ground. Jack Macnamara commanded his men through this freezing hell with a rigid, unflinching discipline. The former politician, the man who had navigated the aristocratic drawing rooms of London and the shadowy, illicit underworld of Berlin, was now unrecognizable. He wore the mud and the exhaustion of the frontline infantrymen. He operated out of damp, freezing command posts, reading topographical maps by the dim light of kerosene lanterns, calculating the grim mathematics of sending young men up heavily defended slopes. He was a sitting member of Parliament, a man who technically could have utilized his political connections to secure a comfortable desk job in Whitehall, far away from the shrapnel. Yet he chose to remain in the mud with the territorial volunteers of London. In the freezing mud of the Apennines, Macnamara's past and present violently collided. The seasoned German troops holding the high ground, the men directing mortar fire onto his battalion, were the exact generation he had pursued in the Tiergarten. The boys of the Hitler Youth had grown up. The people he was now sworn to destroy were the people he had once paid for his own gratification. Seeking a violent absolution, he commanded with uncompromising discipline, risking his own life daily to destroy the very military machine he once secretly funded. While Macnamara was fighting for his life and his conscience in the freezing rain of the Apennines, his former secretary was operating in a vastly different climate. In London, Guy Burgess was thriving in the warm, secure heart of the British establishment. The contrast between the two men, who had once shared a train carriage to Berlin, was absolute and sickening. Macnamara was paying the physical price of war. Burgess was profiting from its chaos. Thanks to the impenetrable shield MI5 had inadvertently thrown around him by covering up Macnamara's crimes, Burgess had completely bypassed any rigorous security vetting. He was now a trusted insider, moving seamlessly between the BBC, the Foreign Office, and the covert sabotage divisions of British intelligence. He spent his days drafting propaganda and attending high-level strategic briefings, and his nights frequenting the clubs of Soho and Mayfair. He was charming, erratic, and universally accepted by the men running the war effort, and he was betraying them every single day. The intelligence Burgess gathered was not low-level gossip. It was top-tier strategic data. He had access to the minutes of the War Cabinet, the shifting foreign policy objectives regarding the post-war division of Europe, and the identities of British operatives. He meticulously photographed these documents and handed the film to his Soviet handlers during brief, silent exchanges on the dark streets of London. While the men of the London Irish Rifles were bleeding out on the Gothic line, trusting that their government was doing everything possible to secure their victory, Burgess was actively handing the geopolitical blueprint of the future over to Joseph Stalin. The treason that had started as a reckless game in a Berlin hotel room had metastasized into a massive systemic hemorrhage of British state secrets. The British intelligence services remained entirely blind to the predator operating within their own walls, their vision permanently obscured by their initial refusal to investigate the MP who had brought him in. They had sacrificed operational security to protect the reputation of the Conservative Party, and the Soviet Union was reaping the massive dividends. By December 1944, the war in Italy had reached a bitter stalemate. The weather had worsened, grounding Allied aircraft and turning the roads into impassable rivers of mud. The strategy shifted from broad offensives to holding the line and executing localized violent raids to keep the enemy off balance. For the men on the ground, it was a miserable, grinding existence, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. On December 22, 1944, Jack Macnamara left his command post to inspect the forward positions of his battalion. It was a routine action for a dedicated commander, a necessary risk to maintain morale and assess the tactical situation firsthand. He navigated the communication trenches, speaking with the exhausted, freezing riflemen holding the line against the German forces. War is rarely cinematic. It does not pause for grand speeches or narrative resolution. It is fundamentally indiscriminate and brutally abrupt. There was no sniper's crosshair, no dramatic final stand against an overwhelming assault. There was only the sudden, terrifying shriek of incoming artillery. A German mortar shell, fired blindly from a position somewhere high up in the Apennines, plummeted toward the British lines. It was a statistical probability, a piece of jagged metal falling from the sky, indifferent to the rank, the history, or the secrets of the men below. The shell impacted the ground near Macnamara's position, detonating with a concussive force that shattered the freezing air. Colonel John Robert Macnamara was killed instantly. The shrapnel tore through his uniform, violently ending his life at the age of 39. The Member of Parliament, the commanding officer, and the national security risk was silenced permanently in the mud of northern Italy. He died before he could face justice for his actions in Berlin, before he could witness the final defeat of the Nazi regime, and before he could see the catastrophic damage his former secretary would inflict upon the British Empire. The telegram confirming his death activated a highly efficient, silent machinery within the British state. The government swiftly capitalized on his battlefield sacrifice. The press eulogized him as a paragon of virtue, while MI5 quietly closed his heavily compromised file, sealing the reality of his Berlin excursions in the deepest vaults of Whitehall. The ticking time bomb of Gestapo blackmail had been defused by a random mortar shell. They assumed the threat was buried forever. They were catastrophically wrong. With Macnamara's legacy perfectly sanitized, the institutional shield around his former secretary solidified. Unscrutinized and trusted, Guy Burgess burrowed deeper into the Foreign Office and MI6, passing the most vital nuclear and diplomatic secrets of the West directly to Moscow. When Burgess finally defected to the Soviet Union in 1951, the sheer scale of his espionage crippled British and American intelligence. The desperate internal audits inevitably traced the genesis of the disaster back to the unexamined parliamentary trips of 1936. The legacy of Jack Macnamara stands as a chilling historical lesson. In a desperate attempt to protect a politician's reputation and avoid a moral scandal, the establishment manufactured a hero. But by bearing a traitorous liability, they left the back door wide open for a spy who would alter the course of the Cold War. Ultimately, the most dangerous threats to a nation are rarely the enemies across the border. They are the secrets the state refuses to tell about itself.